Imagine a city where the streets are paved with smooth stone, where water flows through underground pipes, where gardens hang from the tops of terraces so high they seem to float in the air, and where all of this happens 600 years before Christ was born, while the rest of the ancient world still lived in mud huts and drank water from open wells. There was a place on earth where more than 200,000 people woke up every day within walls so wide that two chariots could race side by side on top of them. This city had straight avenues, temples covered in gold, and palaces with gardens irrigated by machines that shouldn't have existed at that time. And you have heard its name many times, Babylon. But here is the question almost no one asks. What was it really like to live there? Not as a king, not as a priest, but as an ordinary person who woke up in the morning, had breakfast, worked, and came home. What did they see? What did they smell? What did they eat? What did they fear? The answer is so surprising that it will completely change the image you have of this city. Let's start with the moment you approach Babylon for the first time. You are walking through the Mesopotamian desert, modern-day Iraq, and the heat is brutal, over 113 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. The landscape is flat, dry, and monotonous. Sand and more sand. And suddenly on the horizon something appears that makes no sense. First, you see a dark line. Then that line grows, gains shape, and gains color. And when you get close enough, what stands before your eyes is a blue wall. That's right, blue. The outer walls of Babylon were coated with glazed bricks in deep blue tones, decorated with relief figures of bulls and dragons, painted in yellow and white. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited the city around 450 BC, was so stunned that he wrote, "Babylon surpasses in splendor any city of the known world." And keep in mind, Herodotus had already seen the pyramids of Egypt. The numbers are hard to process. The inner wall had a perimeter of 26 kilometers, 26. To give you an idea, a modern marathon is 42 kilometers, meaning the inner wall of Babylon alone covered more than half a marathon. The thickness, according to Herodotus, about 25 meters. That is wider than a 4-lane highway. And the height reached 90 meters in some sections, the equivalent of a 30-story building. Now, modern historians believe Herodotus exaggerated the measurements. Archaeological excavations by Robert Coldewey, begun in 1899, suggest that the inner wall was about 12 meters high and 6 meters thick, with a second outer wall of similar dimensions. But even these reduced numbers are extraordinary for the ancient world. And between the two walls, there was a water-filled moat fed by the Euphrates River, making any frontal attack practically suicidal. But here is the detail no one tells you. The walls were just the shell. What Nebuchadnezzar II built inside them would make any ancient visitor question if they had entered another world. You would cross one of the city's 8 monumental gates, and the most famous of them was the Ishtar Gate, dedicated to the goddess of war and love. This gate still exists. It is in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, reconstructed from the original pieces excavated by Coldewey. And when you look at it, the first thing you feel is that this shouldn't have existed at that time. Cobalt blue glazed ceramic bricks with 575 relief animal figures, bulls, lions, and dragons, individually molded and colored. Each figure glowed. Imagine passing through this gate at dawn with the sunlight hitting these blue and gold animals. The effect was deliberate, to make you feel small, to make you feel like you were entering the domain of the gods. And after the gate, you would step onto the procession way, a ceremonial route nearly a kilometer long, with 12-meter-high side walls, all coated with the same glazed bricks and decorated with 120 relief lions, 60 on each side, representing Ishtar. The floor was made of white and pink limestone slabs, and each slab had an inscription on the bottom that said, "I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. I paved the street of Babylon with slabs for the procession of the great Lord Marduk. May Marduk, my lord, grant me eternal life. He signed the floor. He literally stamped his name under every stone where people stepped. This says a lot about Nebuchadnezzar's ego, but also about the scale of resources he had at his disposal. If this has already impressed you, leave a like right now so this video reaches more people who love biblical history. Now let's get into real life, because Babylon wasn't just palaces and temples. It was a living, noisy city, full of people from every corner of the ancient world. And the daily routine of an ordinary Babylonian was much more sophisticated than you might imagine. The day began early, before sunrise. Most Babylonian houses were built with sun-dried clay bricks, adobe, and had an open-air central courtyard. This courtyard was the heart of the home. It was there that the family cooked, ate, worked, and even slept on the hottest nights. The surrounding rooms were dark and cramped, functioning more as storage and sleeping quarters in the winter. The houses did not have windows facing the street. Everything faced inward toward the courtyard. This was intentional. It protected against the heat, the dust, and the eyes of neighbors. Breakfast, if we can call it that, was simple. Barley bread, dates, and beer. Yes, beer. Babylonians consumed beer in quantities that would impress any modern person. But it wasn't the beer you know. It was a thick, cloudy drink made from fermented barley bread, often consumed with a reed straw to filter out the solid bits. There were at least 20 different types of beer, catalogued in cuneiform tablets. Sweet beer, dark beer, thin beer, superior quality beer. It was the drink of the people. Men, women, and children drank it. Not because of alcoholism. The fermentation purified the water, making it safer than drinking straight from the river. It was, literally, a matter of public health. And the food? Here comes something that will surprise you. We have Babylonian recipes, real recipes, written on clay tablets dating from approximately 1750 BC, the oldest recipes ever recorded by humanity. 3 tablets, preserved in the Yale Babylonian collection, describe more than 35 recipes for stews, broths, and meat dishes. Lamb cooked with beets, onion, garlic, cumin, and coriander. Beef broth seasoned with leek and beer. Stuffed pigeon roasted in a clay oven. We are talking about sophisticated cuisine, with layers of seasoning and preparation techniques that show centuries of gastronomic tradition. But food wasn't the same for everyone. And here begins the part that reveals how Babylon really worked from the inside. Babylonian society was rigidly divided into 3 classes. At the top were the Owilim, full citizens with rights, landowners, wealthy merchants, priests, and palace officials. In the middle were the Mushkenum, free men but without property, who depended on the palace or the temple to survive. And at the bottom were the Wardum, slaves. And when I say slaves, I'm not talking about an abstraction. The Code of Hammurabi, written in Babylon around 1754 BC, dedicates dozens of laws to the treatment, purchase, sale, and punishment of slaves. A slave could be bought for the equivalent of 20 silver shekels. For reference, an ox cost between 10 and 15 shekels. In other words, a human being was worth little more than a farm animal. Now here is an important nuance. Slavery in Babylon was not exactly like the modern slavery we know. Slaves could own property, conduct business, accumulate money, and in many cases, buy their own freedom. Some slaves ended up wealthier than free citizens of the Mushkenu class. Hammurabi's laws even stipulated punishments for those who mutilated a slave without justification. The owner lost half the slave's value as a fine. It wasn't compassion, it was property protection. The slave was an investment, and damaging them was a financial loss. But don't romanticize this. Slaves could be branded with iron, runaways were hunted. Anyone who helped a slave escape paid with their own life. That is what Law 15 of the Code of Hammurabi says verbatim. And female slaves were frequently used as concubines. Was a slave's life in Babylon better than in many ancient civilizations? Perhaps. But it was still the life of someone who belonged to another person. And now comes a detail that changes the whole story. A large portion of the slaves in Babylon during the Golden Age, the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, between 605 and 562 BC, were Jews. The book of 2 Kings, chapter 24, verse 14, records that Nebuchadnezzar deported 10,000 captives from Jerusalem in the first deportation, in 597 BC. Among them were the best craftsmen, blacksmiths, soldiers, and all the nobility. The prophet Ezekiel was among the deportees. Daniel, according to tradition, had already been taken years before, still a teenager, in the first Babylonian incursion. Imagine being Daniel. You are a young man from the nobility of Jerusalem, raised in the faith of the God of Israel, and suddenly you are walking chained for 1,500 kilometers across the desert until you reach a city that makes Jerusalem look like a village. You cross the Ishtar Gate. You see the shining dragons and bulls. You hear languages you don't understand. You smell incense burning in the temples of gods that your parents taught you to reject. And now they tell you your name is no longer Daniel, it is Belteshazzar, in honor of the god Bel. They want to erase who you are. If you believe that God never abandons his own, even in exile, comment, God is faithful. But let's return to the streets of Babylon, because the daily life of this city still has much to reveal. After breakfast, the city woke up for good, and the sound was unmistakable. Imagine the noise of thousands of people moving at the same time, vendors shouting prices in the markets, hammers hitting in the metalworking shops, wagon wheels creaking on the stone, the lowing of oxen and the bleating of goats being led through the side streets. Babylon was a commercial center on a global scale. Caravans arrived from Egypt bringing gold and linen. From India came spices and precious stones. From Anatolia, silver and copper. From Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, came pearls. The Euphrates River, which cut the city in half, functioned as a water highway, with boats transporting grain, dates, wool, ceramics and beer. The main market was near the great temple of Marduk, the Esagila, and functioned like a stock exchange of the ancient world. There was no minted currency in Babylon at that time. The system was based on the weight of silver. Every transaction was made by weighing pieces of silver on a scale. The shekel was the standard unit, equivalent to about 8.3 grams. And everything was recorded. Everything. The Babylonians were obsessed with documentation. Every purchase, every sale, every loan, every marriage contract, every legal dispute, everything was etched into clay tablets, sealed and archived. We know this because hundreds of thousands of these tablets survived. The University of Pennsylvania collection alone has more than 30,000. It is the largest bureaucratic archive of the ancient world, and it tells us line by line what real life was like in this city. And do you know what these tablets reveal? That Babylon had a financial system that would make any modern banker pay attention. There were families that functioned as banks. The most famous was the Egibi family, a clan that operated in Babylon for over a century, from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar to the Persian period. The tablets show that the Egibi granted loans with interest. The standard rate was 20% per year for silver and 33% for grain. They bought and sold property, managed agricultural lands, collected debts, and even operated a credit system that allowed merchants to do business without carrying physical silver. We are talking about letters of credit. In the 6th century BC, while most of the world was still bartering goats for wheat, Babylon already had compound interest contracts recorded in clay. But commerce was just one layer. Babylon was not just rich, it was ingenious. And nothing demonstrates this better than how they handled the most fundamental problem of any desert civilization: water. The Euphrates River passed directly through the middle of the city, cutting it into two halves, the old city in the east and the new city in the west, connected by a stone bridge that, according to Herodotus, had pillars spaced so that boats could pass underneath. But the river alone was not enough. Babylon controlled one of the most complex irrigation systems of the ancient world, a network of canals that distributed water from the Euphrates to farms throughout the Mesopotamian region. These canals were not improvised ditches. They were planned engineering works with regulating sluices, storage reservoirs, and distribution calendars managed by temple officials. And here enters something that completely changes the perception of what Babylon was. The city didn't get rich by accident. It got rich because it controlled the food. The plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, Mesopotamia, which literally means between rivers, was one of the most productive agricultural lands on the planet. Wheat, barley, dates, sesame, onion, garlic, lentils, chickpeas, everything grew in abundance when the irrigation worked, and Nebuchadnezzar invested heavily in this infrastructure. He built new canals, restored old ones, and expanded the arable lands. Result: an agricultural economy that fed not only the capital, but sustained a standing army of tens of thousands of soldiers and financed the most ambitious construction projects of the ancient world. But all this wealth created a dangerous paradox. And this paradox is what makes Babylon so relevant to this day. The richer the city became, the more inequality it produced. The cuneiform tablets show a clear pattern. Throughout Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the concentration of land in the hands of a few families increased drastically. The temples, especially the Esagila, the Temple of Marduk, became the largest landowners and the largest employers in the city. Priests controlled farms, breweries, weaving workshops, and grain warehouses. A free citizen who fell into debt could lose his land, his goods, and even his children. Babylonian law allowed debtors to hand over family members as temporary slaves to pay off debts for a period of up to 3 years. This is in the Code of Hammurabi, laws 117 to 119. Now think about the absurdity of this. A city with golden avenues, hanging gardens, temples that shine under the sun, and at the same time, families losing their children because they couldn't pay what they owed the temple. The grandeur of Babylon was real, but it was built, at least in part, on the suffering of those who supported the foundation, and that is exactly what the prophets of Israel saw. When Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Habakkuk speak of Babylon, they are not just describing a military enemy, they are describing a system. Jeremiah says, "O you who dwell by many waters, rich in treasures, your end has come, the measure of your greed." The word is precise: greed. It is not just power, not just strength, not just idolatry, it is greed. The prophets looked at Babylon and saw a civilization that turned abundance into exploitation, ingenuity into oppression, and geographical blessing into a moral curse. But wait, because what happened inside the ordinary homes of Babylon reveals an even more surprising layer of this civilization. Babylonian domestic life was governed by contracts. Literally everything was contractual. Marriage, contract. A man didn't propose, he negotiated a legal agreement with the bride's father, stipulating the tahatum, the bride price paid by the groom to her family, the sheriktum, the dowry given by the bride's family to the couple, and the conditions for divorce. Everything's recorded on a tablet, witnessed, and sealed. And here comes the detail that catches many people by surprise. Babylonian women had significant legal rights. A wife could own property in her own name. If the husband died, she inherited. If he mistreated her, she could file for divorce, as long as she proved the abuse before judges. The Code of Hammurabi, Law 142, says verbatim, If a woman hates her husband and declares, "You shall not have me as a wife," her case will be investigated by the council of her neighborhood. If she is innocent and he is negligent, she shall take her dowry and return to her father's house. Now do not idealize it. The same code also said that if the woman was found guilty of negligence in the marriage, she would be thrown into the water, that is, drowned. Law 143 is brutally direct, and women caught in adultery were tied to their lover and thrown into the river. The Babylonian legal system was sophisticated, yes, but it was equally sophisticated in its power to protect and to destroy. Children were born at home, assisted by midwives. Infant mortality was very high. Estimates suggest that between 30 and 40% of children died before the age of 5. Infections, diarrhea, malnutrition. Babylonian medicine was a mixture of real empirical observation and exorcism rituals. Medical tablets describe symptoms with impressive precision. If the patient has fever, night sweats, and coughs up blood, but the treatment often involved incantations to the god Marduk and purification rituals with holy water. Disease was seen simultaneously as a physical phenomenon and a spiritual attack. And speaking of spirituality, this is perhaps the most fascinating and disturbing part of daily life in Babylon. Religion was not a separate department of life. It was life. Every aspect of the daily routine, birth, marriage, harvest, travel, illness, dreams, had a spiritual dimension that needed to be managed. The Babylonians believed they were surrounded by invisible forces at all times. Gods, demons, spirits of the dead, all interacted with the human world constantly. And at the center of all this was the great temple of Marduk, the Esagila, with its stepped tower that dominated the sea's horizon. That tower has a name, you know, Etemenanki, which in Sumerian means the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Many scholars believe it is the inspiration for the Tower of Babel described in Genesis 11, a 7-story structure, each painted a different color, reaching between 60 and 90 meters in height. At the top, a sanctuary coated in blue glazed bricks where, according to Herodotus, there was a golden bed and a golden table and no statue. The place was reserved for a single woman chosen by the god Marduk, who supposedly descended to meet her there. If this surprised you as much as it surprised me while researching, comment, "I didn't know." The New Year ritual, the Akitu, was the most important religious event in Babylon, and it lasted 12 days. 12 days of elaborate ceremonies involving the king, the priests, the statue of Marduk, and the entire population. And on the 5th day, something happened that doesn't seem possible in an absolute monarchy. The high priest stripped the king of his regalia, slapped him in the face, and pulled his ears. The king then knelt before the statue of Marduk and swore that he had not sinned against the city, that he had not neglected the temples, and that he had not humiliated the weak. If the king cried during the humiliation, it was a sign that Marduk was satisfied and the year would be prosperous. If he didn't cry, it was a bad omen. Think about that. The most powerful man in the known world, the conqueror of Jerusalem, the destroyer of Solomon's temple, kneeling, taking a slap in the face from a priest, begging for the approval of a statue. It is a scene that says more about Babylon than any wall or hanging garden. And this religiosity penetrated every corner, every house, every decision. Before leaving home in the morning, a Babylonian consulted omens. The flight of a bird, the shape of a cloud, the pattern of oil poured on water. Everything was interpreted as a message from the gods. There were entire catalogues of omens recorded on tablets. If a crow caws to the right of a man, his business will prosper. If it caws to the left, he will face a loss. Thousands of entries like this. Babylonians did not make important decisions without consulting a diviner, the Baru, who examined the liver of a sacrificed animal to read the future. Dozens of clay liver models have been found, divided into zones with notes on what each mark or anomaly meant. The irony is striking. a civilization capable of astronomical calculations that predicted eclipses with precision, that mapped constellations and measured time with sophistication. This same civilization did not dare build a wall without first opening a sheep's liver to ask the gods for permission. And it is exactly at this point that life in Babylon reveals its greatest paradox: the coexistence of genius and superstition, of technical advancement and spiritual slavery. Because while the priests read livers and kings knelt before statues, in some corner of the city, a group of Jewish exiles refused to bow. Daniel and his companions lived in this exact environment. They breathed this air, they walked these streets, they heard these rituals every night, and they said no. The book of Daniel, chapter 3, records the moment when Nebuchadnezzar erects a 27-meter-high golden statue and orders the entire population to prostrate themselves before it at the sound of music. Everyone obeys. The entire religious, political, and social machine of Babylon bows in unison, except for three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And when confronted directly by the king, their response is one of the most powerful phrases in the entire Bible. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace. But even if he does not, know, O king, that we will not serve your gods. Even if he does not. That is the faith that Babylon could not buy, burn, or break. But daily life continued, indifferent to these spiritual dramas. And there is a dimension of Babylon that rarely appears in documentaries: the nightlife. When the sun went down, the city did not sleep. The temples lit torches that illuminated the inner courtyards, and the smell of incense, cedar resin, myrrh, and storax spread through the surrounding neighborhoods. The taverns opened, and yes, Babylon had taverns. Many of them were managed by women. The Code of Hammurabi dedicates specific laws to tavern owners, the Sabitu, regulating prices, prohibiting them from accepting credit from certain customers, and stipulating the death penalty for any tavern keeper who allowed conspirators to meet in her establishment. The death penalty for serving beer to the wrong people. This shows how seriously the Babylonian government took social control, even in leisure spaces. In wealthy homes, the nights included music, harps, lyres, drums, and flutes. Instruments we know, because they were found in excavations and represented in wall reliefs. Music was an integral part of religious rituals, but also of secular entertainment. Banquets for the Babylonian elite could last hours, with dishes served in sequence, wine imported from Syria, and performances by professional musicians. And in the streets at night, the darkness was almost total. There was no public lighting. Anyone who went out after sunset carried a torch or hired a light bearer. Residential neighborhoods became dark labyrinths, and crimes increased. Legal tablets mentioned cases of assault, robbery, and home invasion frequently enough to indicate that nighttime security was a real problem. There were night watchmen, the Masaru, patrolling certain neighborhoods, but coverage was limited. The practical recommendation, implicit in several texts, was simple: stay home after dark. This is the portrait of a Babylon that movies don't show. It wasn't just a city of gold and hanging gardens. It was a city where a woman could manage a business and be thrown into the river by the same legal system. Where a slave could accumulate wealth but would never own himself. Where geniuses of astronomy decided the day to plant wheat by looking at a sheep's liver. Where the greatest power in the world bowed before stones, and 3 foreign exiles refused to do the same. And here is the question that Babylon forces us to ask to this day. Is it possible to build a brilliant civilization on wrong foundations? Because everything Nebuchadnezzar built, every wall, every temple, every garden, disappeared. It literally vanished. When Alexander the Great arrived in Babylon in 331 BC, the Etemenanki Tower was already in ruins. He planned to rebuild it, but died before he could. Today, what remains are mounds of earth in the Iraqi desert, marked by archaeological trenches and looting craters. The city that made Herodotus lose his words turned to dust. Isaiah prophesied with surgical accuracy. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. And that is exactly what happened, not by an explosion, not by an earthquake, little by little, slowly. The river changed its course, the canals dried up, the people left, and the bricks that once shone in blue and gold were swallowed by the sand. The lesson of Babylon is not that powerful civilizations fall. Everyone knows that. The lesson is why they fall. And that answer, written more than 2,500 years ago by the prophets who were dragged in chains through its streets, remains as relevant today as the day it was spoken. If this video impressed you, click on the video appearing on your screen right now. I guarantee it will surprise you even more.